Please all rise.
Ladies and gentlemen, the 56th Governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo.
Over 10 months, I have watched with incredulity as the liberal left has unquestioningly and unequivocally embraced policies that are not only illiberal, but authoritarian.
Well, good morning to all.
With each passing day, those on the left liberal side of the political spectrum display greater acceptance of increasingly oppressive measures. Maybe I should have been prepared. With more and more frequency during the past years, I have found myself departing from my cohort's consensus during various discussions arising from current events, particularly insofar as they pertain to civil liberties issues. More disturbing than the substantive disagreement was the utter lack of regard for difference of opinion among many of my peers. Nevertheless, I did not anticipate that the left would soon abandon all pretense of concern for liberal values, which are widely understood to consist of tolerance, open-mindedness, and protection of individual rights and dignity. At this point, those of us unfortunate enough to live in blue and purple states, as well as in many other parts of the world, have been deprived of our basic liberties for nearly a year. We cannot freely associate with other people, operate our businesses, send our children to school, or travel to many places without having to isolate for 2 weeks, which often translates into visiting loved ones becoming a practical impossibility. College students are imprisoned in dorm rooms for weeks because they or someone they interacted with tested positive for the virus. I'll leave the topic of the unreliability of these tests for another day. They are expelled, harshly punished, and shamed for attending parties and socializing in groups. It's no surprise that condemned for engaging in the most natural activities for those their age, suicidal ideation, depression, and drug usage have skyrocketed in this demographic. Children are forbidden from playing with one another or forced to do so while muzzled. These oppressive policies, which at face value constitute grotesque violations of civil rights and liberties, are enacted and enforced primarily by democratic politicians. For the most part, these pandemic management strategies are lauded by their constituents and center-left publications alike. To the extent they are criticized from the left, it is usually for failing to enact the measures sooner or enforcing them more stringently. Particularly chilling is a piece published in the New York Times on January 4th, 2021, called "In a Topsy-Turvy Pandemic World, China Offers Its Version of Freedom." Notably, this article appeared not in the opinion pages, where arguably it could defensively be printed, but in the news section, and accordingly can be deemed representative of the Times' views. It is worth pointing out that the Times' influence cannot be overstated. It is the journalistic arm of the democratic establishment and informs the consciousness and values of the urban professional class. One can be fairly certain that the beliefs of most doctors, teachers, lawyers, and professors will reflect the ideas propagated in the paper. The premise of Ms. Yuan's piece is that the post-Enlightenment values that until recently were considered non-negotiable in most Western democracies, freedom of speech, freedom to worship, freedom of assembly, are dispensable. That is because, according to Ms. Yuan, China has triumphed over the virus, needless to say, by trampling on these very rights, and in doing so allowed for a different set, the freedom to live a normal life. The West may find it has to work harder to sell its vision of freedom after China has made its model seem so attractive. Who is to say which rights are more important? Ms. Yuan next speculates that the global crisis could plant doubts about other types of freedom, as nearly half of voting Americans supported a president who ignored science and failed to take basic precautions to protect their country. Some Americans assert that it is their individual right to ignore health experts' recommendations, to wear masks, putting themselves and others at increasing risk of infection. These are an astonishing set of assertions. They appear to call into question the importance of democracy itself, and more vaguely, the rights of Americans to make their own decisions about their health and to question and dissent from government mandates. Perhaps I'm naive, but I was under the impression that in a free society, people are at liberty to evaluate the evidence for any proposition, especially one as personal as whether or not to wear a face covering, to assess the risk and to act accordingly. More disturbing, evidently, the rights of the individual are no longer sacrosanct.
Whenever you want.
Rather, they may be subverted for the betterment of society. People should not be forced to choose between leading a normal life and possessing fundamental civil liberties. Both are absolute, immutable features of a liberal democracy. Conveniently, the article fails to mention that China's willingness to sacrifice the individual in furtherance of the communal good has led to the creation of concentration camps for Uyghur Muslims that include practices such as torture and forced sterilization. Amnesty International's China 2019 page opens by observing that the human rights situation continued to be marked by a systematic crackdown on dissent. The justice system remained plagued by unfair trials and torture and other ill treatment in detention. China still classified information on its extensive use of the death penalty as a state secret. Likewise, Human Rights Watch states that China's government sees human rights as an existential threat. Its reaction could pose an existential threat to the rights of people worldwide. At home, the Chinese Communist Party, worried that permitted political freedom would jeopardize its grasp on power, has constructed an Orwellian high-tech surveillance state and a sophisticated internet censorship system to monitor and suppress public criticism. Abroad, it uses its growing economic clout to silence critics and to carry out the most intense attack on the global system for enforcing human rights since that system began to emerge in the mid-20th century. Ms. Wan's article is simply a more express admission than many of the paper's more subtle suggestions that liberal values are overrated and ought to be abandoned in favor of virus suppression policies that do not bother with such annoyances as human rights. A recent op-ed argues that doctors who question the efficacy of masks and social distancing should have their licenses revoked. Another heavily insinuates that speech deemed a danger to the Republic should be illegal. Ms. Yuan's article also bears striking resemblance to various recent, for instance, The Economist and The New Yorker, implying that perhaps we should look to China and adopt its virus management strategy. Many in the scientific and medical community have similarly expressed admiration for China's approach.
A very sustained commitment to getting the job done. So we congratulate the frontline workers and the communities in China for having reached such a successful outcome.
Gregory Poland, director of the Vaccine Research Group at the Mayo Clinic, observed that China's success could be attributed in part to a compliant population and a government that can put bigger constraints on individual freedoms than would be considered acceptable in most Western countries. Apparently, some members of the New York legislature agree that the CCP's model should be emulated. Lawmakers in the state are contemplating a bill that would permit the state to forcibly detain individuals who might be carrying an infectious disease. It is not difficult to imagine a near future in which people like me, who refuse to abide by inhumane, nonsensical, and never-ending dictates, end up behind bars as potential pathogen carriers. Likewise, in a fashion that would make leaders of the CCP proud, critics of lockdown and mask policies are silenced by the media and educational institutions.
I teach this course on propaganda at NYU. Been teaching it for years. It's always fully enrolled. Students are waitlisted. The responses are extremely positive. All I'm doing is trying to teach them how to perceive and assess propaganda drives ongoing at the time the course is taking place. So I don't teach it as a remote historical thing. I don't teach it as something that, the Nazis did, the Soviets did. I teach it as something that affects us every moment we're alive. It affects us in the profoundest ways. So I necessarily have to have them contend with the propaganda that's in the air at the moment. Well, what's in the air at the moment is the whole COVID narrative. And at the beginning of the class, in explaining how we were going to proceed, I brought up as an example the mask mandates, the mask propaganda. And I mentioned to them that there are 8 or more randomized controlled studies, all the randomized controlled studies of mask wearing among healthcare professionals have come to the same conclusion. They have all found that masks do not prevent transmission of respiratory viruses. I mentioned this in class. I urged them to read those studies for themselves. I also urged them to read the more recent studies finding otherwise. I offered suggestions as to how they could assess their veracity. You look at reviews by scientists. You see what university the researchers are working at. Do they have contracts with Pfizer? Do they take money from the Gates Foundation? This is just elementary stuff, okay? Well, one student who joined the class late was so incensed by my even mentioning these studies that she took to Twitter and demanded that NYU fire me. And this wasn't just one tweet. This was like a stream of vituperative tweets. She was incensed. She hadn't read the studies. He hadn't spoken up in the class where we discussed it. She insisted that NYU fire me. And to my astonishment, NYU has sort of taken her side.
Not only have the scientists who wrote the Great Barrington Declaration, which rejects the lockdown approach to coronavirus management, been personally and professionally persecuted, but they have faced significant efforts to silence them, leading one writer to observe that their critics want them removed from the public sphere. This has all the characteristics of a modern high-tech witch hunt. Keep in mind that these are 3 of the world's preeminent epidemiologists. A free liberal society fosters open discussion and debate, does not silence and punish those who offer opinions that depart from the consensus, however inconvenient those ideas may be to the people in control. Nor does it prevent them from seeing family and friends, educating their children, and earning a living. It certainly does not contemplate imprisoning people in detention camps because they could carry a pathogen. Maybe I was naive to be so startled by the New York Times article Topsy-Turvy Pandemic World and its thesis that we should remake our conception of freedom in the image of China's. In retrospect, it was the natural next step in the creeping authoritarianism that I witnessed for about a decade and has crescendoed in the last year. It is as close to an express concession as I have seen thus far that the liberal left has entirely abandoned the tenets of liberalism. Even Neil Ferguson, whose wildly inaccurate imperial model spurred lockdowns in the West, was surprised that the public acquiesced to the China-style virus suppression measures. That the liberal left appears untroubled by the grotesque violations of civil rights and liberties we have witnessed over the past 10 months tells us all we need to know. Human rights are negotiable under this new ideology, but it bears no resemblance to liberalism whatsoever. To the extent we have not gone quite as far as China in violating human rights in the quest to suppress the virus, the consensus on the liberal left is plain. We have not gone far enough. One of the particular features of tyrannical regimes is that most people remain unaware of their true nature until they have solidified their grip on power. It is far easier to acquire and maintain control over a population that at least initially believes the governing force is benevolent. Pick up a history book if you believe that in the near future the pandemic will be declared over and normal life will resume. Nothing about the actions of leaders such as Governors Cuomo, Whitmer, and Newsom ought to lead people to believe that life will ever be the same unless we refuse to accept this erosion of our civil rights and liberties. Each day, I hope that my friends on the liberal left will wake up and see what is happening before their eyes, for it is too late.